All right, welcome to another episode of Health Revolutionaries. I'm super to introduce Dr. Larry Norris. He's a political activist, educator, and social organizer. He graduated from the University of Michigan with biophysiology and cognitive science. He wrote his doctoral dissertation for the California Institute of Integral Studies on the ayahuasca experience, meaning making, and identity transformation. He's the co-founder and board member of Decriminalize Nature. He's also the co-founder and executive director for entheogenic research, integration, and education, known as ERIE. And he has a very strong belief in empowering others to find their own path to personal healing through education. So, Larry, would you like to introduce yourself and anything that I might have missed?
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you very much, Jamie, for having me on. It's a pleasure. I love to talk about all these wonderful topics. I think you hit all the things on the nose there. Only thing would be biopsychology and cognitive science for my undergrad at the University of Michigan. That was before they started calling it neuroscience. So this was in the late 90s, 94 to 98 timeframe. So quite a bit has changed since then. But I noticed during that process, when you start studying the internal workings of the brain, often on the other side of that is animal research. And that was for me where I was like, I maybe need to go find another pursuit, because waking up every morning and doing these things with animals and, to get grant money for the university basically wasn't really sitting with me well. So I decided to do a nice long road trip around the U.S., moved to Hawaii for about 11 years. In that process, I came across ayahuasca. I had already known that I was very interested in studying psychedelics. I had gone to when MAPS was just a little small office in Charlotte, North Carolina at the time. I went to them to see, hey, what other researchers and professors out there are doing this research. So I did like a nice long road trip to kind of like visit universities and see what people were doing. And a lot of people were like, they were doing biofeedback research or they were doing some other neuroscience research. And then this was kind of on the back burner, the sort of hidden research. And I realized, hey, I would really like to be explicit with research I'm doing and not have to do two research projects just so I can get this other one that I'm really more focused on done. So I took a little sabbatical. About 11 years I stayed in Hawaii. I came across ayahuasca at that time, became very fascinated by the inner experience, about meaning making and all these kind of things, which we'll talk about in a bit. What is integration? How do we help people back from big experiences? Those different types of things. And that's when I decided to go to California Institute of Integral Studies, which is a transpersonal psychology school in the San Francisco Bay Area here. One of the few left standing right now. I think quite a few of the other ones have unfortunately been bought out by business schools and things like that. So lost a little bit of sort of that primary focus, which was what is psychology beyond the self, basically. We have a lot of this psychology now, which is clinical psychology or CBT or, all these different types of forms of psychology. Even Jungian psychology to some degree is kind of, it steps into this range where we're talking about archetypes and spirit and that type of thing. But really looking at I think James Fadiman and a couple other folks were the ones who kind of, started the transpersonal psychology movement, basically based upon the psychedelic research that was doing. Is like, okay, we need to have another psychology that can speak to mystical experiences, that can speak to spiritual experiences, that can speak to weird paranormal experiences or visions or things like that we weren't really talking about in sort of the mainstream academic psychology at the time. So that was something that I thought was really a good place to go. Then, like you said, I just finished my dissertation not too long ago, so that I actually finished it 3 days before lockdown, so that was nice. Just got that out of the way, just in the nick of time.
Lucky.
Unfortunately, that also means that my graduation, is just a name on the screen. So that was a little bit of a bummer. So I'm still looking forward to having an actual walk down the stage, get my hooding and all that kind of stuff, right? So, but it was a great process. I learned a lot in that process. I learned really a lot about what is integration, what things do we need to be aware of, how are different scholars looking at this idea. And then also the difference between meaning making as integration, but also then a lot of times people talk about implementation sort of blended in with integration, and really seeing, is there a way to separate those out, spend some time meaning making and then spend some time applying those. And I really kind of see ERIE as sort of the integration process, the meaning making process. How do we deal with all these big experiences? How do we engage with them? And then I really see Decriminalize Nature as kind of the integration process. Okay, now that we've sort of got those insights, how do we apply these in daily life? How do we make social change? How do we transform society, culture? Plant and mushroom medicine, obviously we're dealing with something that's also against the law. So there's a really easy thing to say, hey,
Mm-hmm.
how can we apply these insights? Well, let's first and foremost, let's change these laws around this, because everyone should be able to have access to these are
Mm-hmm.
plant mushroom medicines that are used across the world, different cultures all over the place. Almost all of our ancestors have worked with plant medicines in some way, whether they're entheogenic or just medicinal plants in their culture or their area. But these ones specifically that we're speaking about are illegal. So I took a little
Mm-hmm.
sort of put some of the other academic pursuits to the side to engage in this process, which is more political activism. I was not really too familiar with political activism before 2018. This is really kind of my first go at this, but I think it was really important because it allowed me to realize that the government works for us. And how do I engage with the city
Mm-hmm.
council?
Mm-hmm.
And what about direct democracy? And what does it mean for, making change happen on the citizen level, on the grassroots level? And oh, wait, this is actually possible. You can kind of get disillusioned when you see some of the state and federal stuff, and there's deep pockets influencing a lot of the folks. But on the city level, city council members are members of the community. They're also there. They're also going to the same neighborhoods. They have the same want for the community to be healed, those different types of things. Um, so I think that's been a really beautiful thing to kind of see from my perspective, is not just like, hey, let's change this law, but like, wow, now actually I know whatever kind of social change I would like to engage in. And this is one of the things we're teaching people all across the US as well. All these other things, we can actually say,
Mm-hmm.
hey, this is how we make change. This is how we put a resolution in. This is how we talk to our city council. This is how we write a press release. This is how we do all the things, build community, build your base, all that kind of stuff, which I think is critical for, an engaged constituency, which I think is what democracy is all about, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this movement is so beautiful because it's not just about empowering people to take control of their health. It's empowering people to become part of the tribe again and be part of the community and really having a voice where I feel like in this day and age, a lot of people are a little lost in
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
arena.
Mhm.
So let's get into Decrim Nature if you want. Let's start with that, and then I'd really like to hit Eerie because I feel like you said, like the Decrim Nature is going to be giving us these medicines, and then Eerie is going to be like the actual program that's we're going to follow for the integration.
Sure.
So the first thing I wanted to start with is a lot of people I feel like get confused, like what's the difference between what Denver did and what Decriminalize Nature is all about?
Sure. So to start off, we when we met together in late 2018, the conversation that came up, because we didn't meet to talk about decriminalizing anything. We met as a group of local organizations that were like, hey, let's build a conscious community center where people can come and do yoga, talk about transpersonal psychology, do integration work, all that kind of thing. And one of the things that kept coming up is, wouldn't it be great if we could engage in plant practices as well? And then so the conversation came up about Denver, a conversation came up about Oregon. We were kind of, discussing the differences between the two. And then we're like, hey, we could probably do this here in Oakland. And so the difference, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
between Denver and ourselves, there's a couple different ones. They passed about a month before we did. So they passed in May of 2019. We passed in June of 2019. Their campaign started significantly earlier than ours. Ours basically started in January of 2019 for the most part. So it took us about 4 or 5 months. Ours was and that was because we did a city council vote. What they did was a ballot initiative process. So ballot initiative processes are
Mm-hmm.
significantly more expensive. You need to, obviously educate a lot more people, because you need everyone to vote for it.
Mm-hmm.
Here on the city council, you
Mm-hmm.
really just need to educate a handful of people, under 20 typically on city councils. There's not over 20 people usually on city council, except for like Chicago and New York, which are bigger cities, which a little bit of a bigger uphill grind there. But basically, um, so that's the sort of the logistical difference. One was a ballot initiative process, and one was a
Mm-hmm.
resolution process. The second difference would be
Mm-hmm.
that um, Denver focused purely on decriminalizing psilocybin mushrooms. We were like, hey, that's great, but that's Denver. We live in the Bay Area here, San Francisco Bay Area. All these communities are here. Why do we want to separate
Mm-hmm.
them all out and do this one at a time over the next 30 years to decriminalize all these different plants and
Mm-hmm.
mushrooms? We have an ayahuasca community here. We have a DMT community here. We have an Ibogaine community here. We have a cacti community here. Let's bring everyone together. And so this really was helpful because it, worked in unison with our name. It's like we're not just trying to decriminalize
Mm-hmm.
this. The detractors might say decriminalize a drug or a mushroom, magic mushroom, and then they're like, oh, you're just trying to get high or whatever else. We're like, let's have a conversation about nature. Let's have a conversation about our
Mm-hmm.
relationship with nature. Let's have our conversation about our self-agency and sovereignty around our own relationship with nature. We can grow our own plants. We don't have to deal with big pharma. We don't have to deal with venture capital. We can grow mushrooms. We can grow these other plants in our backyard. And so it puts sort of the power of the medicine back into our hands. And so that was another big thing that we really want to
Mm-hmm.
talk about is this larger container, not just mushrooms, but all the different plants. And if you look at it, we talk about, four main categories by the compound. But when you look at the number of plants, this is
Mm-hmm.
like thousands, I think thousands of combinations of plants or plants and mushrooms that would be under this umbrella. So, for example, ayahuasca,
Mm-hmm.
which is a combination of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and MAOI, which is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor from the chacruna plant, has the DMT, and the MAOI comes from the Banisteriopsis copuvine. If you put those together, it's basically modulating DMT. So it gives you an orally active DMT, where naturally our belly would metabolize it really quickly, and you wouldn't really have a DMT experience if you drank it. But obviously, there's some
Mm-hmm.
folks in South America who discovered over many years that if you put these two things together, like peanut butter and chocolate, wow, there's a longer DMT experience. You have a 3 to 4 hour DMT experience, and there's a lot of speculation to how that came about. Some say Jeremy Narby says that a lot of the curanderos and the ayahuasqueros said the plants told them that. There are other people who say that it was a mixture of two different communities that kind of came together, and one would be working with, like, for example, ananthana, which is a DMT snuff, and one would be chewing on the Banisteriopsis copuvine, and they traded it, and they were like, wow, if you put these two together, this
Mm-hmm.
whole other bigger experience happens, right? But those are plants that are in South America. If you look at it, I think Jonathan Ott put a study together, and Dennis McKenna as well, that said there's possibly 4,000 different combination of plants that create that same
Mm-hmm.
DMT MAOI modulation, whether it's acacia or Syrian rue or um, you know um, lilikoi. I forgot the other name of the lilikoi. Passion fruit, which has MAOI in it. Even chocolate and mushrooms has this MAOI DMT
Mm-hmm.
ish kind of. It's not DMT technically for mushrooms, but I'm saying it has that same sort of modulation effect. So
Mm-hmm.
so we're really wanting to have this bigger conversation about these different plants and the broader spectrum of them. Another thing that we did differently than Denver was that Denver decriminalized use and possession, and I don't believe
Mm-hmm.
anything I saw had anything to do with cultivation. And this is a kind of a typical of the drug policy
Mm-hmm.
movement. And unfortunately, you see this. You even saw this in Oregon. Oregon M110 and M109. M109 legalized psychedelic
Mm-hmm.
therapy, or psilocybin therapy, I should say,
Mm-hmm.
and then M110 decriminalized all substances with the limit cap, right? But they didn't. It's still
Mm-hmm.
a felony to grow your own. It's still a felony to harvest your own. It's still a felony to share in community. And that's because those different
Mm-hmm.
categories are underneath these big scary words like manufacturing or
Mm-hmm.
distribution. So we're trying to peel those out, because at the end of
Mm-hmm.
the day, if you have policy organizations that are only decriminalizing use and possession, where are people going to get that from? They can't grow their own.
Mm-hmm.
Then they have to
Big
go to the
pharma.
dispensaries. They have to go to pharma. They have to go to these other places to get
Mm-hmm.
the thing that grows in Oregon. Mushrooms grow naturally all over the place. Like, there's enough mushrooms out there.
Mm-hmm. And
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
and you're speaking to the thought of we're really growing local economy with decriminalized nature, because we know that these medicines are going to be taken off Schedule 1 soon, and we know that big pharma is going to be part of it, and that's going to be the synthetic version of it. So when we're talking about, like, with nature, we're talking about local economy is what you're really talking about here, right? When we're talking about cultivating, it was growing, right?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, so that's really
No, you're good.
the next step, right? So first step we want to do is to decriminalize, and what that does is that it sort of levels the playing field. What you don't have is you don't have
Mm-hmm.
legalization models where you have to have a really, like we're seeing with cannabis, a really expensive license. You need $1 million to get your grow space. You need, licenses all across the way. You
Mm-hmm.
need lawyers and legal teams that do all the stuff, and it gets out of hand. Obviously, that's only for
Mm-hmm.
specific types of people that can get into those models because they need the capital to be able to do it. And then what happens if you don't
Mm-hmm.
decriminalize first is that those folks can use the law basically you have to buy my product. you know, if you don't buy my
Mm-hmm.
product, you're an illicit grower. If you don't buy my product, then you're doing something against the law. If you don't buy my product, then we can arrest you. And so that's kind of a scary
Mm-hmm.
thing to think about. And you're seeing this even with home growers around cannabis in certain places. Like growing cannabis at home is still illegal. But you can go down the street and
Mm-hmm.
have 300 pounds of cannabis in there, and that's no problem. So first thing we want to do is decriminalize. We want to get everyone on the same page there. Second thing we want to do then is
Mm-hmm.
create these local economies that you're speaking to. So how do we engage, make sure
Mm-hmm.
that, it's farmers markets or collectives or things where people are, know people in their community. And this also is, it's a model of abundance, right? We really want to push this model of
Mm-hmm.
abundance because scarcity is what makes people
Mm-hmm.
makes these experiences very expensive. And also it means that there's bad actors that can come in, and there's not enough people out there
Mm-hmm.
to wipe that bad actor thing. You're seeing a lot of stuff right now with maps, seeing a lot of stuff right now with a couple other
Mm-hmm.
different communities out there that some of the people that are running these organizations are getting kind of hit pretty hard for some of the misconduct that they've done in the past. But for some people, that was the only place for
Mm-hmm.
them to go. Instead of having, like two options and one of them is a bad actor, now you have 50 options and everyone knows through word of mouth this
Mm-hmm.
person's doing good work. Because even if you have 50 different people and you've had good experiences with 40
Mm-hmm.
of them, maybe for somebody else it just doesn't work with their vibe and they only are connected with two or three of those. But either way, we have a lot of different options. So I think that's a good thing. So again, this local economy means that, people are able to grow on small scale, as we saw with COVID.
Mm-hmm.
When you have
Mm-hmm.
worldwide supply chain issues or global supply chain issues, then everyone gets hit everywhere. But if we can go back into this localism
Mm-hmm.
where we can grow our food locally, where we can grow our medicines locally, where we can connect with community
Mm-hmm.
locally, I think that's sort of the way to move forward, especially as we're seeing right now. It's so obvious now that we've had this sort of issue around, supply chain issues and all that kind of stuff. So go local is kind of the next step for us. Also within that is sort of this Oakland community healing initiative that we've been working on here in Oakland, which is basically like how do we train and offer support for people that are doing community-based ceremony. Not everyone is going to necessarily be able to find a sitter or a friend that can help them out. Some people have higher acuity issues that they might need to work with. So how do we make sure that the people that are doing ceremony, holding ceremony, are also protected? So that's something we're working on down the line as well. But those are kind of like the next steps, step 2 and 3, if you will, with the decriminalization being the first part. So that's something we're working here on in Oakland as sort of a
Mm-hmm.
experimental zone, kind of a space to kind of see how this would work. And then on the other cities right now, we're working more on the decriminalization aspect until we get to that next step.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I want to speak to the legalization versus decriminalization because I feel like when I hear it in conversation, like people kind of get confused. Like, no, it's not legal. When we say decriminalize, it means we're just cutting the funding that would put you in jail.
Right. Yeah. So decriminalization and legalization are kind of two different models. The way that we work this on the city level, and the reason that we have to do this on the city level is because, and you may or may not be dealing with this in Arizona. I'm not sure. I know other places they have this home rule. Some places don't have home rule. Basically, what that means is that some cities can't change the law and be in conflict with state
Mm-hmm.
law. So how do we work
Mm-hmm.
around that?
Yeah.
So the way that we work around it with the Decriminalize Nature resolution so far is that we deprioritize. So it's making this amongst the lowest law enforcement priority. Basically, if somebody was jaywalking, that would be, as much of an issue, which never gets addressed anyway, than would be if you had mushrooms on you. And then the second thing we do is basically
Mm-hmm.
like I don't want to say defunding because that's such a trigger word now, but a reallocation of funding
Mm-hmm.
away from investigation, persecution, and arrest. So basically, it takes away any resources that people can use for investigating, persecuting, and or arresting people for entheogens, and that gives kind of the teeth to the
Mm-hmm.
deprioritization. So basically, what we're doing on the city level is a de facto decriminalization, where it's a deprioritization and a defunding, which then would be the equivalent. And what the power of the city has is to control the purse strings for their city. They say, hey, we have
Mm-hmm.
our budget. This is what our budget can do. We don't want to waste any money on arresting people for this because it's not worth our time or our energy or our resources. So basically, on the city level, that allows them to have the power over what happens locally. Now, this changes again when you have to go to the county, which would be the sheriff or the state or the federal. But even with cannabis, it's still illegal federally. But obviously, states have no problem selling, cannabis all over the place. So it's about building a movement of power from the grassroots up, and then establishing those communities. Because I think on the other side of that is then creating those support structures, right? So, okay, if we
Mm-hmm.
were to do a statewide decriminalization measure, but you don't necessarily have communities in this town, or this town, then if somebody has a challenging or difficult experience, which does happen, I mean, we're still working through this, we're still figuring out
Mm-hmm.
how to rebuild culture around this. Then they have some support there, or
Mm-hmm.
they might not have support if they didn't have that support structure. So by doing this on a city level, we're actually able to help build that support structure. I do a lot of trainings and workshops with folks that are in these different cities to help. How do we do an integration circle? How do we put together events? All these different types of things, so that there can be some local infrastructure there, which then would lead to the go local as well. But on this level, we're just looking at decriminalization and the support structure. Now, legalization, on the other hand, is more of a licensure regulatory framework, and oftentimes, like I said, gets really expensive and can lead to $5,000 retreat center that nobody can pay for anyway,
Mm-hmm.
or particular
Mm-hmm.
setting that is maybe oppressive for many different communities. Not everyone really vibes with the therapeutic setting, or the therapeutic paradigm even. And so how can we find other
Mm-hmm.
ways that can work with folks that they can actually engage in these practices without having to have the potential hypersuggestibility of these experiences affect the experience. And so if we do this locally, if
Mm-hmm.
we have opportunities for people to, have a culturally relevant setting, I think that'd be really critical. Now, the legalization model, though, or the medicalization or the clinicalization model, unfortunately goes in that other
Mm-hmm.
direction. And um, so what we're trying to do is to, know that that's going to happen down the road, more than likely, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that
Mm-hmm.
the companies, the venture capital companies that are trying to jump in on this, are really too familiar with this work either. Like they think, oh, this is going to be another cannabis thing where people are going to be coming in a dispensary and buying tons of cannabis every day, and da da da. It's like, people are like, oh, I have one experience a year, maybe two a year. It's not something that I'm doing all the time, because if you have a big experience, then usually you need some time to like sit and let it work through you and all that kind of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, microdosing is a little bit
Mm-hmm.
of a different scenario, but again, a microdosing is such a small dose that you're not really having a full-on experience. But even that, it's a small number. It's not something that these companies are going to make billions of dollars on necessarily, but they like to think they are. So we'll see how that goes. But our model, we talked about this right at the beginning, was like, okay, knowing that that's coming down the line, what can we do, since we can't stop it? We don't have the billions of dollars to stop that. What can we do to help alleviate that? And I think the way to do that is to teach people
Mm-hmm.
about growing, is to make it really abundant, because then if everyone has access to their own, then how is those big companies going to monopolize, the industry, so to speak? Everyone's like, oh yeah, that's great that you're selling, these there for X amount of dollars, and I have to get 15 licenses to do it, but I also have my own grown in my backyard, and thank you, I'll take those. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I think that the two models will kind of happen. Our focus really is on decriminalization, or kind of this go local model. On the state level, we would like to do
Mm-hmm.
something like descheduling, or exempting from the Controlled
Mm-hmm.
Substances Act, because what that's doing is basically saying we don't need to create these huge regulation frameworks for something that shouldn't be illegal in the first place. So let's just, we hear a lot
Mm-hmm.
about let's reschedule, but what that means, every time you reschedule, it doesn't take it away from being illegal. It just means that now the medical industry has control over it, right? You go from Schedule 1, which has no medical value, to
Mm-hmm.
Schedule 2. Now you can prescribe it. Schedule 3, Schedule 4, Schedule 5, those are prescription drugs, so to speak, right? They're not
Mm-hmm.
people medicines, so to speak. So if we can just deschedule, meaning getting it off of the Controlled Substances Act, or exempt it from the Controlled Substances Act, then we don't have to worry about all those regulations, and just let people grow their own like they would tomatoes or corn or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. And so I want to kind of go towards the direction of like recreational versus medical, because that's kind of always the debate as well. Because medicinal is one way, but I feel like when people talk about recreational, I feel like there's kind of more of like a negative innotation with that. Like it's more of like a high risk doing so. So can you kind of talk a little bit towards
Yeah,
that?
totally. I think that's one other of the that's a mistake that happened with cannabis, but it's also a byproduct of the way the Controlled Substances Act is set up. And I think that's a false
Mm-hmm.
dichotomy, that it's either medical or it's
Mm-hmm.
recreational. And because
Mm-hmm.
exactly what you're saying is like, okay, if it's prescribed by this doctor for XYZ condition, it's okay. But anything else is fooling
Mm-hmm.
around, or high risk, or partying, or all the different stigma that people put around the word recreational. But what about sacred experiences?
Mm-hmm.
What about personal and spiritual growth? What about insights? What about creativity? Sure, you could argue that those are recreational, but they're not recreational in the same way that we speak to them. So we really want to expand this
Mm-hmm.
conversation out between medical and recreational, to not just be about you know pathologizing a condition and this is healing for it, and then everything else is lesser than. but like say, hey, there's actually like 10 or 20 different tendrils of ways that we can have this dialogue and have this conversation. And obviously, this, like I've said, that was kind of set up by the Controlled Substances Act because one of the criteria for Schedule 1 is that it has no medical value. So then everyone's now rushing
Mm-hmm.
to pursue a way to prove that it has medical value just to deschedule it off of Schedule 1 or to reschedule it off of Schedule 1. Okay, we've proved now that it has medical value, like, cocaine, coca, and poppy have been proven to have medical value in certain places, and so now that's Schedule 2. But again, that just puts that into the hands
Mm-hmm.
of the medical industry, so to speak. So I think that's a big
Mm-hmm.
conversation to have, and kind of we want to kind of switch out of that and have this, start talking about religious freedoms. Start talking about personal and
Mm-hmm.
spiritual growth as something that's valuable in life. The Johns Hopkins study on healthy
Mm-hmm.
normal says this is one of the top 5 most meaningful experiences for people. Where does that go under the context of
Mm-hmm.
medical or recreational? Super important, you
Mm-hmm.
know, but not really available. And
Mm-hmm.
it even it forces us, and this is something I'm very fascinated by as someone that is interested in psychology, it forces us to re-ask questions about what is mental health. Why is this working for
Mm-hmm.
depression? Well, it doesn't just like change your serotonin receptors. It's like, well, I realized that I was disconnected. I realized that this trauma that I had, I was able to reform the narrative around it. I was able to forgive
Mm-hmm.
people or forgive myself, or I was able to reconnect to the sacred or my community, or wow, I'm a part of nature, and nature's all these different aspects of these experiences are part of it. And it's not just something as simple as like, oh, this changes your neuronal, chemical imbalance or those different types of things, right? So there's some really good articles out
Mm-hmm.
there right now about sort of the medical industry and how this sort of rush to pathologize everything um, is a bad move for psychedelics. Not even that, but also just because imagine right now the FDA trials that are happening for psilocybin. Those are going in terms
Mm-hmm.
of treatment resistant depression. Okay, so in order to get
Mm-hmm.
into that with the inclusion exclusion criteria, you have to have now a lifelong diagnosis of treatment resistant depression. So now it's on your record that you have depression and you maybe you're suicidal or whatever else just to have an experience which helps you for in ways that isn't just about your depression but about reconnection, these different types of things. So I think that's another
Mm-hmm.
aspect of this. When we start talking about mental health, we talk about medicalization, there's this sort of move to diagnose, and then you're kind of in the books as being sick
Mm-hmm.
or unwell or what have you. And that shouldn't be
Mm-hmm.
how you have to approach these medicines because they're much farther beyond that for mental health.
Mm. Yes, well said. So, and then I also want to talk about because a lot of people are concerned about addiction. Can you speak towards addictive properties of psychedelics?
Yeah, totally. So I know we'll go back to the neuronal on the sort of the neurochemistry level. It's totally different in terms of addiction. Typically, the
Mm-hmm.
addictive quote unquote substances out there are hitting on the dopamine reward system. So just like when you go onto social media and you see that little red light, they're playing with the same thing. That's a reward system. It's like the Pavlovian dog. You see the light, you drool, you're like, oh, it's something, and I'm gonna go press it and see what's going on there, right? So that's kind of like the same dopamine reward system, right? Well, all psychedelics work on a
Mm-hmm.
serotonin system, tryptamines, phenethylamines. Typically, that's what they're working off of. So um, it's like a different neurochemistry. So in terms of these experiences, you're not going to have the same um, physical addictions as you would have with the dopamine system. There might be psychological, wants or desires where people are going to want to go back to the same experience. And we hear about that in terms of the idea of spiritual bypassing. Like, oh, I had this big spiritual experience. I realized that I have to go, you know, be a better person, but actually I'm just going to have another experience next month and then it'll be all better, and that's why we have to talk about immigration and these different
Mm-hmm.
types of things, right? So there is that potential there in
Mm-hmm.
terms of people wanting to have more experiences or those different types of things. But in general, from a physical addiction potential, it's not there in the same way. In addition, a lot of these materials, a lot of these substances actually work for helping with addiction. So there's some studies right now around, and there's been studies for quite some time around iboga for opioid addiction or opioid substance issues, right? And I actually have a good friend of mine
Mm-hmm.
who, the story, he was one of the first patients in St. Kitts with Dr. Mash we did the studies, I think in the 90s, something like that. And she was looking at ibogaine for
Mhm.
heroin substance issues, right? And my friend
Mhm.
said that he had been doing
Mhm.
heroin for probably about 15 to 17 years, something like that. He started having
Mhm.
dreams that was basically like, you're out. If you don't quit this, you're not going to live through this year. And so he was like, okay, well, I got to
Mhm.
figure something out here because I'm going to die otherwise. And the biggest thing with a lot of these, opioid addiction is that the want might be there, but the cravings and the withdrawal are so
Mhm.
difficult for the person that they can't ever break out of it.
Mhm.
Because yes, they could want it all day
Mhm.
long to get out of it, but then the next day they wake up and they're in pain and they're sore and they're feeling the need or the craving to have more, and it's hard to sort of break through that. He said that he had an
Mhm.
iboga experience or ibogaine experience, which is about 24 to 36-hour experience, is pretty heavy duty. Um, he said from
Mhm.
a inner experience, he was able to go back to those traumas that led to his substance use issues, and he said I was able to revisit them with
Mm.
the emotional volume was turned down. So it's like now I'm not
Mm.
so stuck in the experience, but I'm able to take like a step back, really
Mhm.
see it again and rechange that narrative. So from the psycho spiritual aspect, it helped. But then ibogaine also helps on the
Mhm.
sort of craving and withdrawal part of it. So for about 5 days after, maybe a little bit more, you have like a window of opportunity where you don't have any cravings, you don't have any withdrawals, and you're able to sort of reassess life, replan habits, redo things that could
Mhm.
be towards a more healthy life and that different type of thing. And this is actually how it was
Mhm.
found by, I think Howard Lotsoff was the person who discovered that it was useful for heroin addiction in like the 70s. I could be wrong on those dates, so double check on that. But what do you call I guess the story goes that he was looking for heroin. He wasn't able to find any. Somebody's like, hey, you should try this ibogaine stuff. He's like, all right, well, I need to do something tonight, you know. So he did the ibogaine, and then there's a story about him waking up the next morning. He said, "Is like I had some orange juice, I made my coffee, I read the morning paper. It was like halfway through the day, and I was like, I haven't thought about heroin once. And usually I'm like, as soon as I wake up,
Mm.
I have to do my heroin, otherwise I have these withdrawals. So that like woke people up to being like, oh wow, not only is this an ancient traditional practice which is used in Gabon for visiting the ancestors, but now also it also helps people that have sort of the problems of the Western world, which is these major addictions and things like
Mhm.
that, or people are stuck on things that maybe they don't want to be, and this gives people a way out. So ibogaine would be one of those. There's some studies too on
Mhm.
ayahuasca for addiction or substance use issues. There's some
Mhm.
studies, even I think they're looking at mushrooms or psilocybin for tobacco cessation, which I think is an interesting thing too
Mhm.
because what we're really getting at is the substance is the thing that people are talking about. But underneath that, what we're really
Mhm.
talking about is this sort of addictive quality or substance issue quality, right? Because if you look at some of the
Mhm.
traditions, tobacco is also a master plan. And so
Mhm.
tobacco isn't the addiction part; it's the something else going on there, right? The tobacco, if done in a proper way, has been used in many different cultures as for cleansing, for purging, for connecting to the ancestors, to the spirits, and all these different types of things.
Mhm.
So again, this is Western science looking at this and says, okay, a lot of people have an
Mhm.
issue with tobacco. How are we going to help them solve that issue with tobacco? And really, what it is, it shouldn't even really be tobacco. How do we help people solve this issue around substance use stuff? Because the tobacco in and of
Mhm.
itself wouldn't necessarily be problematic if you look at some of the traditional cultures where this is respected and revered and used occasionally for particular moments and these different things, like you see with mapacho and ayahuasca, or you see with mushroom ceremonies, that type of thing. So there's a lot of really interesting research out there right now that show not only are these substances not addictive, but actually they can help treat addiction and substance use issues. And so I think that's really critical, especially right now, especially with COVID. There's so many people that have, you
Mm.
know, been stuck on substances over this last 2 years or gotten involved with them more so. I
Mhm.
have quite a few friends that have, overdosed on, contaminated things that they had that had fentanyl in them and things like that. And so it's a really
Mm.
difficult time right now for a lot of folks. So for folks that are dealing with substance use issues, this is an opportunity for people to kind of explore something and to find that deep sort of connection to self that maybe missing otherwise.
Mhm. And not to mention, there's a huge opiate crisis out there right now,
Yeah.
not just from heroin, but from medication as
Right.
well. So that's really exciting. Like all with all this research, that help is on the way and it's
Right.
coming.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I will. So, for the people that are still resistant to this idea, can you speak to that? What do you have to say to them? People that are like, "Nope, this is a bad idea. It's dangerous. It's not good." What do you have to say to those people?
I would say first and foremost that you know that often is a reflection from people that are sort of stuck in the, the stigma or the pushback from the 60s or the 70s, right? That era of
Mhm.
time where even the word
Mhm.
psychedelic is kind of emerging from. And that's one reason we use the word entheogen versus
Mhm.
psychedelic, to try and remove some of that baggage. It also speaks to it as rather than a recreational or mind manifesting experience, which is what psychedelic means. It's about inner divinity. It's about an inner
Mhm.
experience and these different types of things. So I would say first and foremost that these plants and mushrooms have been used for centuries, if not millennia, across the world, and we don't hear about
Mhm.
that much. There's 30 million people that have had over. As of 2014, the guesstimate was around 30 million people have had a psychedelic at least once over the course of their life, and that was 2014. And now it's probably significantly higher. But you don't hear about those folks.
Mhm.
You only hear about the 1,000 or 2,000 people that have done clinical trials, and then the assumption is, oh, this is the only way to do it, right?
Mhm.
What I think we have to talk to people about is that yes, there might be risk, yes, there might be challenges, but there is with everything, and that these are our birthright and connect us to our ancestors. And so, if we can actually sit here and relearn together what it is like to have good culture, good community, good education around this, that will also help. But it's going to take some time. There's going to be some bumps. But at the end of that, what I like to say to people is like, what's more dangerous? Somebody having an experience of something that none of these substances really are lethal by any means. People can have a whole significant amount of mushrooms and still not toxic in that way, or throwing people in jail. And somehow people think that throwing people in
Mhm.
jail is a safer model, which, punitive approaches to this is not going to
Mm.
work at all and hasn't worked. And so why are we spending our time wasting our time? And
Mm-mm.
again, that's for those people. They're also oftentimes concerned of a legalization model where people are selling in dispensaries all over the place and everyone's getting access to it. Again, this is where we say, let's just decriminalize, let's build that culture, let's make sure people are safe, let's bring that education to the community, let's make sure people are doing this in a good way, without selling it all over the place and getting until we have that culture sort of ready to go. So yeah, I totally
Mhm.
get when people say that there's risk. A lot of times, it could be something as simple too as just we make mistakes with a lot of different things. Alcohol, for example.
Mhm.
How many people are
Mm.
working with alcohol, pharmaceuticals, drunken driving, tobacco, all that kind of stuff. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of things out there right now
Mhm.
that are significantly more dangerous. I think there's some quote that somebody said that more people have killed themselves taking selfies than all the entheogens combined, right? So
Oh
the
my
part of being a
goodness.
human being on planet Earth is risk, and we can't nanny each other all the
Mhm.
time to say you can't take this risk because I'm not willing to take this risk or I'm afraid of this risk. Okay, well, not everyone. We're not encouraging everyone does it, but let's make sure that if people do want to do it,
Mhm.
they don't have to worry about going to jail because that also shifts the experience. There's
Mhm.
an element of fear. Set and setting is a big conversation around psychedelic and entheogenic plants and fungi. And when your setting going into it is like,
Mhm.
I'm a criminal, I'm breaking the law, the police could arrest me, that's also dangerous in terms of your inner experience. Because now people are like, they're
Mhm.
scared, they might start thinking about all the different things, and then they kind of, you know, can have a difficult experience that they wouldn't necessarily have had. So that's a
Mhm.
conversation that definitely comes up, and I would probably sit with those folks and chat it out with them, figure out exactly how do we,
Mhm.
what do you really find is most dangerous? What do you worry about in terms of the risk? What things do you think shouldn't? Why do you not think it should be decriminalized? And oftentimes, and we found this
Mhm.
across all the different cities that we work with, some of them have exactly the comment that you had, some of the city council members, and after a period of
Mhm.
education, they move through the other side and say, "Oh wow, this is actually something that
Mhm.
can be valuable." And we don't need to be arresting
Mhm.
people for this. Even police chiefs, I think there's a Santa Cruz police chief at the beginning was like, no, 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 we don't want to do this. This is too dangerous. And then by the end of the time when they passed it, he's like, well, things change and perhaps that's for the better. And he's also thinking, hey, I don't have to spend any more resources on this. This is great, So yeah,
Yeah.
it certainly doesn't mean that we want to be lackadaisical about creating the support structures. We want to make sure that we're informed.
Mhm.
We want to make sure that we are building community around this. But in terms of the risk
Mm-hmm.
or the safety profile, these are a pretty relatively high safety profile. And if we build our community in a good way, I think that we'll be able to do this, and for the benefit of many different people for many years to come.
Oh, very well said. And, I really think that this is going to be an integral part in reforming mental health care and globally as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, and I find it really interesting that you kind of didn't mean to do this, but you've literally started an enormous movement. You went from your community and it has spread through the country and even globally.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I know there's too many to kind of like, I don't know if you want to rattle some off and just kind of let the audience know, like, this isn't small, this is a big thing. So many cities, many states, and many countries are contacting you to help them reform. So would you like to speak to that and kind of talk about how big this movement really
Yeah,
is?
sure. And I mean, I really sort of agree with you on that. When we started this, we're like, okay, this is a one and done. We'll do Oakland and maybe Berkeley and maybe San Francisco in the Bay Area here, and let's get that taken care of, and then we can work forward, and then other people will do other things. But we did still create it in such a way that it was a template that if some other place wanted to grab a hold of it, we're going to give them all the tools. And so that's something we really, really focused
Mm-hmm.
on: decentralized, open source, open access. What do you want? We have our material here. We'd like to sit down with you and have conversations. We'd like to help sort of guide you in the process. What are the bumps and challenges that each city has? Oh, well, this city over here had this challenge. Let's help you out here. So I think that's one of the things that's really helped move this movement forward so quickly, is because it's just like anyone can participate. We really want everyone to participate. We
Mm-hmm.
want to be able to build that culture. But we started in Oakland in say 2019, and then from there, since there to now, I think between 12 and 13 cities, counties have now passed measures to decriminalize
Mm-hmm.
entheogenic plants and fungi, including Oakland, California, Santa Cruz, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, Seattle, Washington, Port Townsend, Washington, Cambridge, Massachusetts, a couple other cities in Massachusetts, Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. had an incredible voter approval. They actually did a
Mm-hmm.
ballot initiative there, and most ballot initiatives you see nowadays are in the 50 to 60% in terms of a win. And that's like, oh yeah, 60%, that's pretty high. Detroit had a 61% voter approval, but they kind of came onto it a little bit late. Washington D.C. had a 76% voter approval, so that's kind of off the charts in terms of the community saying like, yeah, why are plants illegal?
Mm-hmm.
These things that grow out of the ground. How is that
Mm-hmm.
possible, right? So that's where we're at in terms of local movements that have passed so far. I am actually currently putting together a map of different cities and states that are engaging in this process. I think we have 35 to 40 different active cities currently all across the U.S., and that's growing. We're all helping out with ballot initiative language in Colorado, ballot initiative language in Michigan. We're helping out with some legislation in Vermont. We're helping out with, well, we were helping out, and we're trying to now bring it back down. There were some challenges we had with California state legislation. They put some limits on there. They started to get sort of funded by some deep pockets, and so we're a little bit concerned about that. So we took like a little bit of a neutral stance, but we're still trying to put some of that new language in to kind of help support the local community. But yeah, even other countries, and that's hard because it's already an accelerated learning curve from one city to the next, or one state to the next, but
Mm-hmm.
one country to the next is
Mm-hmm.
is tricky because then we have to learn what is policy in that country, because again, the way we're approaching it here is we're using a bit of a loophole, which is who has the budget for the police chief, for the police force, right? Who has the ability to say whether or not this
Mm-hmm.
is a priority or not, and that runs the city level. In
Mm-hmm.
some of these other countries, that is
Mm-hmm.
more centralized, so you don't really have that same opportunity to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So while we've had reach out from Ireland and England and Germany, and even we had someone downloaded a packet from Moscow once upon a time, and Australia, and yeah, it's like all over. I say Chile's. There's some folks from there. I had some meetings with, and in India, there's a bunch of movement. People everywhere are waking up to like, hey, let's change this policy. The challenge is just how do we do this in these other
Mm-hmm.
countries, and hopefully down the line, once we start getting a little bit more momentum here in the U.S., we'll be able to start figuring out how to make this work in other places. But it's been really beautiful to see, and just I think it's eye opening to realize like when you have somebody downloading an infographics packet and a organizer's handbook from the other side of the world, you realize that the conversation is getting out there. And at the end of the day, policy is one
Mm-hmm.
thing, But really, what we're trying to do is
Mm-hmm.
destigmatize and educate community. And so I think that's a huge
Mm-hmm.
success when you see people that are getting the message on the other side of the world and finding it important and really seeing out how do they engage with their own community, or maybe they're just sharing with their community about the benefits of plants and mushrooms. And I think that's really, really critical to this. If we can keep bringing that education forward, then we're already winning. If we can teach people how to grow their own, we're already winning. If we can teach people how to sit in
Mm-hmm.
ceremony in a good way or sit with each other in a good way, we're already winning. Because again, that's
Mm-hmm.
bringing it back to the individual. It's bringing it back to our community, and I think that's really been beautiful to see as this has emerged.
Mm. I totally agree with you. I think it's such a beautiful process that's unfolding right now is that we're all coming together and we're connecting, which I feel like in this world we're so disconnected.
Yes.
So it's not just about the medicine, it's about the connection and the tribe, and
Yeah.
that's been missing so much for so
Yep.
long.
And I've heard
So
that
it's
from,
not just about the medicine.
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, and I've heard that from a lot of people too. In terms of like, if you think about it, this is all happening for the most part during a pandemic when everyone's been locked down
Mhm.
and they've been isolated. And
Mhm.
now it's an opportunity for people to say, like, oh, here's an extra reason. This is giving me hope. This is one of the few news stories out there right now that's
Mhm.
hopeful, right? And some of these other news
Mhm.
stories, not so much, right? So you're absolutely right on
Mhm.
point there. This is an opportunity for all of us that have been kind of sequestered or isolated or not able to connect with family or friends or what have you to come together. Groups, oftentimes people that don't know each
Mhm.
other in these cities, they're like, oh, wow, here's this community right here. I had no idea, right? And then as we change policy and reduce that risk, more and more people come out. Now if you look at Oakland, there's so many educational groups out here now that are engaging in this that wouldn't have been doing this if we hadn't
Mhm.
removed that sort of risk. People from East
Mhm.
Oakland putting together really beautiful events, or other places around here. So yeah, that's really key. And I think you're right. It's like the building of community is really, really, really important. And I think for myself included, gives us something to look forward to right now. In this kind of
Mhm.
difficult time.
Yeah, much needed too. So if people want to find out how to get involved, how to get things started, where can they go? Where can they get this handbook that you were talking about, download it and get the momentum going in their own
Yeah,
cities?
sure. So you can start by going to our website, which is decriminalizenature.org. So I'll let you put that into the meeting notes on the bottom of the podcast there, so I don't have to mess up the spelling there. But decriminalizenature.org is our website. You'll see quite a few. If you
Mhm.
look up Decriminalize Nature on online, you'll see all these other cities that also have websites. So you can kind of check out. Everyone's doing something a little different. We're the main hub at
Mhm.
decriminalizenature.org. You can find our DN
Mhm.
Organizers Handbook on that, either on the About page or on the front page there. You can download that. You can also email me at info at decriminalizenature.org, and I can respond to any emails in terms of, hey, we want to start this up. We're also going to have under our volunteer tabs both a volunteer button. So if you want to volunteer, you can volunteer for all the different things like graphic design, or getting the word out, or helping us with fundraising, that type of thing. Or there's also I want to lead a
Mhm.
DN in my city, and that will be a little bit more sort of
Mhm.
involved in terms of like how many city council members do you have, what types of skills do you have community there, et cetera, et cetera. Also, if anyone wants to donate, of course, we're always looking for donations and fundraising. So there's also donation buttons. We
Mhm.
also take cryptocurrency. We're a pretty grassroots organization. We're pretty lean at this point in time, but as we move forward with some of these state ballot initiatives, that's going to be pretty pricey. Those are oftentimes in the $500,000 to $1 million range plus to do those types of things. So obviously, we're going to be needing some support in that. But then at least we'll be able to be in the driver's seat for those conversations in terms of statewide ballot initiatives, rather than some of the other corporations that maybe don't have the people's best interests in mind. Other than that, you can go to our
Mhm.
social media. On Instagram, we have a pretty good following there. We post pretty much every day. It's at Decriminalize Nature. We also have the same address for our Facebook, and I think on Twitter it's at Decrim Nature, but we've been a little slacking on Twitter recently. But Instagram's our main sort of social media outlet right
Beautiful. So, I think is there anything else you wanted to add about decriminalized nature before we move on to Eerie?
I think that's about it right now. But yeah, don't be afraid to give it a try. Like I say, I had never done this before when I started. So it doesn't matter if you have zero experience. It might take a minute or two to figure everything out. To kind of go through the process to get it. Get your feet wet, so to speak, in terms of local policy and local politics. But definitely worth it. because this is
Mm-hmm.
the type of world we live in, where being engaged with the city council, being engaged with politics is really, really important. So don't let that scare you.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be overwhelmed by the idea of like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be too difficult. It's not. So, we did it in like 3 or 4 months. You also have a lot of people out there who are willing to help you. Sometimes I always tell this to people
Mm-hmm.
too. Some cities, the city council members are just waiting for you to ask. They're not going to do it
Mm-hmm.
themselves. But
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden, if they have 5 or 10 constituents that say, "Hey, this is something important," they're going to move this forward. So I've been amazed.
Mm-hmm.
I've been amazed at how many different cities
Mm-hmm.
now, especially at this point in time, 2 years in, almost 3 years in, we don't have to go over the education part as much anymore. We don't have to let people know,
Mm-hmm.
hey, these can be beneficial for X, Y, Z. It's almost like now we're on the logistical
Mm-hmm.
part. And they're like, how do we do this here? Which is great. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's really important. And then I would say, don't worry if you don't have. It's always good to have someone on your team with credentials or letters after their name or whatever. But don't let that stop you, because the most important and most powerful stories are the ones of transformation,
Mm-hmm.
and that's an N of one. That's the most important study you can possibly have. When you go into the city council member's office and you tell them your story of transformation, or somebody else in your community does, that holds a lot of weight. That's really, really powerful, people, because you get them in
Mm-hmm.
the heart, where we all are connected as community. And so I think that's another thing to
Mm-hmm.
consider, is that your experience is just as important as credentials, as letters after your name, as anything like that. So definitely reach out
Mm-hmm.
to us. We'd love to help you. We'll give you as much information and tools as you need, and we'll celebrate you with you when you complete.
Absolutely. And I feel like this is a lot to do with standing up for your fellow man, because if you won't, then who will?
Right?
And so I really think this is an empowerment thing. Like, don't be afraid, stand up, because we all need to support each other in this time of great need. And so have a voice. Don't be afraid. There's tons of support out there. You don't need to have a degree. You just need to have a story and a voice and a belief that we can actually change the
Yeah,
world.
absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, so I feel like the decriminalized nature is about getting access to the medicine. So once we get the medicines and we need to integrate, we need to understand, and that's where ERIE comes in. So can you speak to how ERIE works with the integration and the education process of these
Yeah,
medicines?
sure. I mean, when we started off with Eerie, we started as a student group at the California Institute of Integral Studies in 2011. We at the time,
Mhm.
even though we were in the Bay Area, there wasn't a lot of organizations doing this work here in the Bay Area. San Francisco Psychedelic Society started about the same time as Eerie did in 2011 time, or maybe just a little bit before that. Um, so um, so we realized, like, wow, there's a big need for people to want to have this conversation, and the
Mhm.
sort of mainstream conversation was going towards medicalization. It was going towards, mental health. It was going towards FDA approvals. I mean, I think I even have a lot of
Mhm.
friends who read some MAPS bulletin from like the late '90s that said you have to go the medical. If you want to get into psychedelic research, you have to go get a medical license, and that's the only way to make it happen, right? Well, some people did, and
Mhm.
a lot of people didn't. You know, but there's still a whole bunch of
Mhm.
conversations to be having. So our thing at Eerie was really like, let's have some of the weird conversations. Let's have the strange conversations. Let's have the conversations about what is the nature of consciousness? What is the nature of reality? What is the
Mhm.
creativity that's inspired by these experiences? What is the sacred? What is
Mhm.
spirituality? A lot of these same sort of
Mhm.
elements that we see in Decriminalize Nature, was really important to us. Or even better, how do we have a
Mhm.
roundtable or a panel where there's people that speak from all these different perspectives, and somewhere in between
Mhm.
there's some truth, or there's some sort of
Mhm.
some groundedness, because everyone's now able to share their
Mhm.
ideas, see how they interact with each other, see how how does the medical relate to this, how does the spiritual relate to this, how does the creativity relate to this. And so I think that's also important. I
Mhm.
would often tell, I know Joe Tafur actually spoke for us once upon a time, or a few times actually, but one of the
Mhm.
things he said before his talk, and he's a medical doctor, has done a lot of great work. He says, well, I'm at an Eerie talk, so I know I can talk about whatever. And we really encourage that from people that came on there, which is basically like, yes, you talk about this thing at all these other conferences, but what do you want to talk about? What are the
Mhm.
things that are
Mhm.
interesting to you about this that you're not allowed to talk about
Mhm.
anywhere else, because of the sort of strict framework of like, well, we have to only use this model because this is the way that's going to get destigmatized or whatever else. But let's open this conversation and do it in a good
Mhm.
way. Do it in a way that's has sources and citations and an understanding and direct experience, and is really thoughtful, but at the same time is different than necessarily what the mainstream conversation was. So that's kind of how we were doing with stuff with education, and we really see education as being, if you want to expand the integration process to a much larger container, we would say education and preparation is part of that. It's part of that understanding. It's part of that meaning making process, right? So bringing that education at the beginning, so people can see what types of experiences are possible, so they're not, taken aback. A lot of the things I did in my dissertation, one of the inspirations was, you look at these Johns Hopkins and NYU studies, and they're talking about unitive. Everyone has this unitive mystical experience, right? Well, unitive mystical experience was defined by W.T. Stace, and then Hood's mystical rating scale. Um, Sort of the way that they looked at this was that unitive mystical experience means positive, blissful, all is one, generally a good experience, these different types of things. But I was seeing in a lot of the integration circles that people were coming to where they didn't have that type of experience. And there was a sense of like isolation or shame, or why didn't I have this positive blissful experiences? Mine was kind of difficult and challenging, and I had to review my ego, and I realized all these blind spots I have and all these issues that I have, and I got to work through this stuff, and da da da. And I didn't have this really positive experience that everyone's talking about, but that doesn't mean that it's not useful or it's not a beneficial experience. It just means it's not, sort of in that same realm of positive blissful unitive. So that was something I looked at in my dissertation: is how can we expand that conversation to really speak to the varieties of different experiences. Not everything leads to one. Even that in itself has a bias to it, right? There's a hierarchy to it. This unitive mystical experience, all experiences eventually lead to one. Whereas you look at a lot of indigenous cultures, they believe in this idea of multiplicity, where one is in everything, right? So it's a different look at that. It's rather not homogenizing everything into this one point of view, which is going to lose nuance. It's going to lose complexity. It's going to lose like all the sort of the richness of the experience. It's like a quantitative experience versus a qualitative experience. How do we turn this very dense qualitative report into a number, which doesn't have any of that density to it, right? So this is kind of the conversation that's happening back and forth right now, is looking at how do we expand this out to speak to a variety of experiences. So what we do with integration is on the other side of that, and integration is about this meaning making, and we really focused a lot on peer integration circles for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, we were noticing that a lot of people were concerned about going to their therapist to talk about a multidimensional experience. Or this entity said this thing to me that helped me realize that I was doing something wrong in my past and I need to make amends, or whatever else, right? But a lot of that stuff, for people who aren't familiar with this, is diagnosable. It's like, okay, you have this, I'm going to give you some medicine, and you're going to totally forget about that. These are not the droids you're looking for, that type of thing, right? So really just kind of like getting all that like sacredness, that sort of external unusual or sort of paranormal or mystical type of experiences, kind of homogenizing it down into sort of psychology, so to speak. So people were like, hey, I want to come to a place where I can speak to other people about these experiences that are peers, that are familiar with the experience, that have insights because they've had similar experiences. And how can we come together and talk about this? And so that was kind of how the integration circles came out. We noticed so many people out there that didn't want to go to a therapist to talk about this, that didn't want to go to their sort of dominant, sort of mainstream models of mental health to talk about this because of the challenges that they would have. They wouldn't be heard, or would be dismissed, or all these different types of things. And so to come to a circle. Now we found, even at the beginning, which I thought was fascinating and some sort of unexpected, when we started doing these circles, there's a lot of other groups that were also felt left out by the mental health regime, if you will, that felt that they could come to these circles. So, for example, we had people that want to talk about alien abduction stuff, or people that had a near-death experience, or people that had experiences that weren't entheogenic, but they actually felt comfortable coming to these circles because it didn't out them right away. It's like, oh, if everyone knows that the alien abduction experience is happening at this room, and you see somebody going in there, like, oh boy, that person, they might have some judgments, right? But here's this like plant medicine thing. Okay, well, that's different. People may have a little bit of, surprisingly less stigma around that. So then would be some of these other things. So people were talking about all different types of transpersonal experiences, and the beautiful thing was that everyone was able to hear them because they were able to relate to their own experiences. Like, okay, whether or not you think that was true or not, we really wanted to have a non-judgmental, non-hierarchical, supportive listening environment. and also with
Mm-hmm.
reflections. And so by creating these circles, we
Mm-hmm.
had a lot of different people come in that were able to talk about their experiences that were transpersonal in nature or strange in nature, if you will, and be able to connect
Mm-hmm.
with others that were doing this type of thing. So that was one element of the circles, which was really great. Obviously, we talked earlier about the isolation that can happen with this. You have a big profound experiences, you don't know where to go, you don't know how to talk to other people about it. Even if some of my younger community, like even people that are involved with this work, they might be like, you say something like, "Oh, last night I got so wasted on mushrooms and my face melted." Everyone's like, "Yeah," and then if you say something like, well, I had this spiritual experience where I was connected, and all they're like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, slow down!" We're not ready for that. Slow down there. So even within the community, there is this sort of inability to talk about some of the more profound aspects of the experience. I had this really
Mm-hmm.
beautiful insight about the nature of reality, and da 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 da, and like people are like, "Oh, that's just you talking, or your ego talking, or whatever else." So there wasn't even space to be held within people's own communities around some of these unusual experiences. So that was kind of another aspect, really bringing people together, reducing that isolation, alienation. And I think the third aspect is that the difference between a peer circle, outside of the dynamics of power and all that kind of stuff, but also versus a one-on-one.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in a one-on-one
Mm-hmm.
scenario, you can kind of like edit
Mm-hmm.
accordingly. You look at the person in front of you, you can kind of shape your narrative and story to the person in front of you, and you're maybe not telling the rawness, the real what happened. We're not being fully authentic in your experience because you're talking to somebody about it and you're shaping it according to that person in
Mm-hmm.
front of you. Especially if that person has power or power diagnosis or is a therapist or whatever else, you might try and shape it accordingly to get into that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you have a peer circle, now
Mm-hmm.
you have 10 people, you kind of have to be raw because you don't know who's in front of you. There's a
Mm-hmm.
variety of different perspectives in there,
Mm-hmm.
and so people can be really real with that experience. And I think that was really beautiful to see emerge too. Is just um, finding people that are okay with being raw about their experience. And the way we set up our
Mm-hmm.
circles, we allow people to have or people have 5 to 10 minutes basically of sharing, and then you get maybe 5 or so minutes, 5 to 10 minutes of reflections. Some people
Mm-hmm.
have a little bit of difficulty around the reflection time because there's a sense, the control mindset is like, well, we want to make sure that every reflection is perfect, and I've sort of realized over the time that, like, we're going to make mistakes. We all do. I really see this as education. We really frame our circles as educational versus as therapy. We can all learn when it's
Mm-hmm.
educational. We're not dependent upon somebody to heal
Mm-hmm.
us. Whereas in therapy, you have that sort of mental sort of understanding that, okay, this person's going to heal me or they're going to help me get to a better space. But if we're all just learning together, that kind of shifts things a little bit. So
Mm-hmm.
when you're dealing with this sort of one-on-one therapy, you're kind of you're allowing for um, you're allowing for the individual to speak to their when you're in the peer scenario, you're allowing for the individual to speak to their experience. You're allowing for that conversation to happen in a way where they're allowing for those reflections, and then all those reflections that are coming through. I've been really, as I was saying earlier, amazed by. They're also learning from the wisdom of the plants themselves. I've been
Mm-hmm.
so surprised over and over and over again the types of things that people are reflecting, insights and
Mm-hmm.
things that I would never would have thought of. And it hits the person like super on point. They're like, oh, yeah, that's totally great. So also releasing our own need to control the scenario and allowing the openness of
Mm-hmm.
people and realizing that the plants are speaking to all of us through this. So that's really important. And then I think, at the end of it is just, at the end of these circles, you have friendships that are being built. It's amazing to me
Mm-hmm.
over and over again. You have scenarios where uh, you call a circle together, and 4 or 5 people that didn't know each other come to the circle, and they all talk about similar
Mm-hmm.
themes. Oh, I was going to talk about something similar too, And so where's that
Mm-hmm.
coming from? It really kind of speaks to
Mm-hmm.
this weird. What is this all about? What is the synchronicity that 4 or 5 people who don't know each other all come in on the same night to talk about something that's similar or some issue they just had or something that happened,
Mm-hmm.
So I've been really fascinated about that. So that's kind of our peer integration circle. I also do some work with sort
Mm-hmm.
of one-on-one, but obviously,
Mm-hmm.
given all those things I just said, obviously I want to keep that open for folks, But that was kind of what I
Mm-hmm.
would focus on with my dissertation is like, how do you help people unpack stuff in a one-on-one scenario that isn't so directive? Oftentimes,
Mm-hmm.
and Gabor Mate does amazing work, but I've sat in some of his peer integration circles, and he's very directive. It's like he's taking you somewhere. Okay, that's great, but maybe that's not where my
Mm-hmm.
experience went, or maybe that's I want to
Mm-hmm.
sort of play with some other ideas before I go there. So in a one-on-one kind of scenario, you really want to sit there and find questions that can help people unpack aspects of their experience versus telling them what the experience is all about. And that's kind of where we dig into this meaning making idea, right? Who's making meaning of your
Mm-hmm.
experience? Is it you? Is it the person who's sitting for you, or the practitioner? Because at the end of the day, it should be you. Of course, there should be discourse, there should be constructive feedback, there should be ways to sort of, suss through the experience to like figure out like, okay, am I totally off base here? Does this make sense? Are there any future readings I can do? Is there ways I can ground this a little better?
Mm-hmm.
Working with art is another good way to do it. These different types of things, but allow that being to emerge naturally. Oftentimes, there's also this goal orientation of integration. Like we need to make meaning now,
Mm-hmm.
but there's also this idea
Mm-hmm.
of symbolic latency and this idea that sometimes an insight doesn't need to be known right now. Sometimes it'll take a
Mm-hmm.
year for you to learn new lessons in your life before that insight makes sense. And then you kind of have this like aha moment. Oh, that's right. That's what that
Mm-hmm.
was all about, right? And I think that's really beautiful too to
Mm-hmm.
see and to not sort of rush to judgment or crystallize the insight in a way that, okay, I had this idea, this is what it means, and this is how I have to move forward. But it's like, okay, I had this idea, I'm going to keep
Mm-hmm.
working with this idea and seeing what emerges over the many
Mm-hmm.
years. And maybe I'll learn something a year down the road. And if I learn something, it might change my perspective on this idea in a really, really positive way. So, um, to allow that to sort of emerge without being too directive, without being too goal oriented, and those different types of things. And so I think that's what I'm looking at in terms of integration and meaning making in general. But ERIE as an organization really focuses on kind of the peer integration circles. Since COVID happened, it's been a little bit harder to do that in circles. I do
Mm-hmm.
have a little bit more difficulty, even right now with with the computer being a little bit slow and everything. All those things happen when you're doing integration circles. It can be kind of tricky, or it drops, the call drops or something like that, and somebody isn't able to, fully tell their experience. You're not able to like get the subtle cues. If somebody's feeling uncomfortable, maybe they're tapping their foot, or these different types of things. You're not able to really see that online. So we've kind of pivoted during the last 2 years and really helping to train people in different cities on how to do the integration circles. And so we've taught a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
workshops all throughout the U.S. so that people can build their own circles, that type of thing. And then now we're just starting to open back up again out here to make it a little bit more open for people to be able to be in person. And so we'll start doing those in-person integration circles before too long as well.
So, if people want to start these integration circles, and from what I'm hearing about them, it's really just a safe space to speak your mind and not have to worry about judgment, which is an extremely beautiful thing, and that's very rare, especially in this world,
Sure.
to feel safe. So, if people want to create these circles, how do they go about finding your classes, finding the Eerie
Sure.
education?
Sure. So yeah, if you want to find our website, it's erievision.org. So that's ERIEVISION.org. We're a 501c3, so we do also take donations as everything else, but we're tax deductible with the Eerie, whereas Decriminalize Nature is a 501c4, so that's a political donation, not tax deductible, but still available to donate. But yeah, if you contact me there at that website, or if you contact me at Larry, Larry, at erievision.org, I'd be happy to set up an appointment with you in terms of putting together a workshop. How do you create this? Also different types of things. I have sort of like a theoretical sort of workshop and also a practical workshop. So you're also getting sort of the overarching context of why it is we do these things, what things to consider when we're talking about paradigms and shifts in paradigms and transformation and all these different types of things, as well as sort of practical, how do we do this in a circle? How do we do this individually? What are some practices to consider? What are some questions we want to ask to unpack this for folks and those different types of things? So it kind of becomes like a
Mm,
two-part little series. And then oftentimes we'll do like a practice workshop or a practice circle for folks so that they get a sense of what it looks like in real life. Because it's one thing to learn it,
mm,
through a workshop, but another thing to
mm-hmm.
actually practice it and see like all the things that come up that maybe you weren't expecting, or that naturally happen anytime you're doing an integration circle. But yeah, that'd be a great way to contact me there. I'll probably also answer those emails if you contact the Decriminalize Nature stuff. So whatever, wherever you're at, I'm
Mm-hmm.
there responding. So it'd be good.
So I just want to wrap this up just to respect your time. Is there anything that you want to add to anything that we touched on, or any last notes or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that we don't talk about much in this conversation is that we really see this as you know, in a world that's tending towards authoritarianism and totalitarianism and control and censorship and all this type of thing, we really see ourselves as being kind of on the front line of consciousness right now. And this is kind of where
Mm-hmm.
conversations are happening. This is where the conversation is most important to happen, is who's going to have control of our consciousness
Mm-hmm.
after this. And so we're in this tug of war between high tech and nature. And so where are we going to go on that line? And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that this is a really important movement for people to engage in, both from the decriminalized nature side of policy shifts, but also from the training people, helping people, engaging with people, educating people, being in community around these experiences, that type of thing. And these plant experiences help us realize that there's more to the world than just what we see in front of us, or more to the world than what some tech people in Silicon Valley can put together for us. Like a lot of times I'm hearing right now, some people say something like, oh, we need to, if you do mushroom experiences, you should do this virtual reality as well. Like, what? No, you just close your eyes. You don't need to.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to have somebody have a program
Mm-hmm.
jump into. Like, let the mushroom program work. That type of thing. Or even, another side of it is I see people talking about artificial intelligence for integration. Which I think is also amazing, because it's like, how is a computer? Because for me, integration is, how do I be more of a human? How do I be a human being on planet Earth? What things can I learn from the plant kingdom and the
Mm-hmm.
plant consciousness that can help me be a better human? And to have, robot or artificial intelligence trying to help you with that process is, to me, a little
Mm-hmm.
bit like, and again, I might be a little biased in my process, of course, but at the same time, I think that's where we're at right now. We're at this very interesting stage where everyone is needing to get. Like, we're all getting sucked into these things that want our attention because they can sell more product, right? That's everything you see,
Mm-hmm.
all social
Mm-hmm.
media, all that stuff. It's, even TV. It's not the program, well, program, right? But it's about, how do we sell our ads in between all that, right? And so, really,
Mm-hmm.
how can we sort of see that that's happening, take a step back and say, hey, wait, we're connected to the earth, we're connected to each other. When we realize that we're part of sacred, it's really hard to control that person, because they're like, hey, wait a second,
Mm-hmm.
I don't need that thing. I know that I'm connected to source. I don't need to go through these middle
Mm-hmm.
people. I'm connected to source. My friends are
Mm-hmm.
connected to source. My community is connected to source. And so I think we're in this space now
Mm-hmm.
where having this conversation about, consciousness is really, really critical. There's this guy, Gene Gepser,
Mm-hmm.
and I won't go into too much, but he talks about mutations of consciousness, right? And we go through these different
Mm-hmm.
mutations of consciousness. He doesn't want to say evolution of consciousness, because we don't know if the next version is going to be better than the previous version. We just know that they're mutations of
Mm-hmm.
consciousness. So he's saying that we're kind of in this like moment now where we're coming out of the mental mutation of consciousness into an integral mutation of consciousness. Mental is very much controlled and hierarchical and number oriented and quantitative and, you know reductionist, and everything that exists has to be measured, otherwise it doesn't exist. And we're moving into this integral, which
Mm-hmm.
sort of is a compilation of the previous 4 or 5 mutations of consciousness, which include magical thinking, which include mythical thinking, which include mental thinking, and those, archaic thinking, these different types of things. So how do we reconnect these broader spectrums of paradigms of consciousness? So we're in a really interesting time in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think that these materials can really help us see that. These materials can help us realize that there's more to consciousness beyond just what we think or are being told in the world. And I think that's really critical, because if you don't know it exists, then how are you even going to like play in that realm or engage with that realm, right? Just even knowing it exists is enough for me.
Mm-hmm.
At least I know when I had that first paradigm shifting experience of like, wow, there's so much more to this than what I realized. Forever shifted. I can never unlearn
Mm-hmm.
that. I can't go back to the person that
Mm-hmm.
was the one that thought everything was just what I saw with my eyes and that was it. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that's really, really a big important part of this that we don't really talk about too much, but I think is really critical in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the movement and us individually in our healing process and where we are as a human
Mm-hmm.
species. But
Mm-hmm.
outside of that, that's probably like a bigger topic to do at
Absolutely.
another time. But I'll throw that at the end for the
I know, right? Like, how can we work in tandem with Mother Nature and that kind of thing?
right.
We'll do another podcast with that, trust
That's
me.
perfect. Perfect.
But before we go, I just want to honor you and give space to your courage and dedication for the movement. I know it's not easy, and sometimes day by day it can be so hard, but I just want to give space and thank you so much, and especially for taking the time because it's one of the most precious resources we're given. So thank you so much for your time and all your energy and everything you do,
Great. Thank
Larry.
you very much, Jamie. Appreciate it. It's been a great podcast. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Oh, thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
We'll talk to you
Sounds good.
later.
Bye bye now.
Bye.